All right, so now that you know a little bit more about research from a theoretical standpoint, why we do it, how we do it, we're going to look a little bit about branching the general research domain or general research idea you may have to research questions to a thesis statement so that you can begin actually conducting the research. So these are the next steps. Here's an infographic of the research process again, just to summarize it for you. So step one is to define the topic or research domain you're interested in exploring. Step two is further narrow that topic for the task at hand. So this is where you engage in the critical analytical framework, conduct your background research, and then create your contextual list of different subparts and subcomponents of your topic to figure out what parts you want to focus on in your 3 subsections of your paper. Step 3 is to gather the background information. So again, that's part of the critical analytical framework, going out and determining the feasibility of your topic, the keywords you want to use, how many sources are available, is your topic feasible, do you need to tweak your topic? Finally, step 4 is to create research questions about your topic. And then take those questions, go out and find sources that answer those questions, and then to develop a working thesis statement for your paper. You will then continue to go back and forth in pulling sources, evaluating sources, and incorporating those sources by citing them and attributing them in your writing, and then finally doing all of this while you're drafting. So keep in mind that this is not it is a chronological linear type of setup here. There's a generalized order you follow, but some of these steps overlap. So you will, while you're writing, you will clearly cite your sources, but you will also be going back and forth to look at your research questions, your thesis statement to keep your ideas consistent and similar, and you'll constantly be looking back and forth through your sources. You're not going to go find sources, have a collection of sources to use, and just use those. It's recommended that you're constantly looking for information as you write and as you spark new ideas in your paragraphs, and then you go and you pull sources. 5 is the minimum amount of sources for this paper. You can exceed that if you want. As I mentioned, the research process is not a linear process. The steps overlap, but you need to follow the general order. Decide the topic, narrow the topic in order to narrow your search parameters or your keywords, for instance. Do your background research or pre-research, create your research questions, answer those research questions by creating a working thesis statement, determine what kind of sources are best for your argument, it will always be references in APA. It's not bibliography. These are not my slides, so I didn't put that in there. Just note your references section will always be references. It will never be works cited. It will never be bibliography. In APA, it's always references as you find and gather your reference sources. And then write and edit your paper. You'll incorporate the research into your own writing and properly cite your sources. I've already talked about this somewhat. You have the research domain, topic, or problem, so the general idea or phenomena you are investigating. Your narrowed research topic is the final focused research topic that you clarify through background research. Your research questions are the questions, open-ended questions or qualitative questions you develop that will answer certain questions about what you want to know in your topic to help lead towards developing a thesis statement. Finally, your thesis statement is the answer to your research questions, all summed up in one sentence that provides direction for the entire paper. Keep in mind, this research paper is an argument you are developing for yourself. So the thesis statement you make is going to be the main claim for your argument. It's going to tell us what you believe, it's going to tell us where you're going, what you're investigating, and how you're investigating it. But just remember that this is not personal at all. So your personal opinions, beliefs, personal words, etc. are not a part of this whatsoever. So there should be no personalized words included. So this is the general first part of the process. This is the first half of the research process. By now, you all probably have some generalized research domains or ideas you're interested in researching. Now the task is to narrow that research topic. So to conduct the background research, look at the sources that are out there, and then develop research questions that you can answer. Take those research questions and the answers to those research questions and then make your thesis statement. And then you can proceed with drafting your research paper. Research questions are huge. They are very important. These questions are going to ask the specific questions you want to discover from your research. Remember, you must ensure that there's enough information out there and enough academic sources to answer your questions. So we always have to remember purpose, right? And the purpose for this research paper is to use 5 sources. So if you have a topic and you're not able to find but 2 or 3 sources, then it's probably going to result in you having to change your topic so that it's feasible. Through background research, you should be able to find basic information about your topic to help answer some of those research questions and then formulate your thesis statement. Here is an example. I'm going back to the autism example because it's such a good one. The research problem or theme, autism diagnoses are extremely high in the United States. And then, so if that's your generalized topic, you ask yourself what you want to know specifically and why, which leads you to a refined research topic. So that generalized topic, the researcher took and applied a direction or a perspective or a way of looking at it. The difference in autism diagnosis rates between Eastern and Western countries. So through this person's initial background research, they probably saw lots of articles and lots of conversation around cultural impacts in spectrum disorders, and maybe saw a lot of cross-cultural or cross-country comparisons. And she wanted to do that for herself and look at some countries that maybe not have been observed. And so he or she refined that topic to the difference in autism diagnosis rates between Eastern and Western cultures. And so here's some research questions she put together to help further understand this topic. The research question 1, why are autism diagnosis rates so high in the United States as compared to South Korea is what she used. What are the differences in autism diagnosis rates between the United States and said country? How does exposure to different cultural elements, attitudes, beliefs, etc., affect autism diagnosis rates between the United States and said country? Research question 4, to what extent does culture affect the stigma behind mental health disorders and seeking treatment? And research question 5, what are the cultural elements that affect the diagnoses of autism in the United States as compared to blank? What are the implications or real-world results of the differences in diagnosis rates, and how does this translate to practice? So you'll notice that all of these questions are really trying to investigate the difference in autism rates by looking at some of the subcategories that the researcher already defined. So through her critical analytical framework, she probably already knew that she wanted to look at cultural elements or dietary elements, stigma of mental health issues, treatment, all of these different things, and then ultimately the real world, why does this matter? She was able to put this together through conducting background research, putting a contextual list together, and then taking those ideas from her narrow topic and creating these research questions of what she needs to know. Then what you do is go out and research and pull sources that try to answer these questions. This is your initial collection of pulling sources and collecting them. And then you begin to answer these questions. So as you have a topic, and as you've narrowed your topic, the next step would be to create these research questions for yourself. I would say 5 to 8 research questions are sufficient. I would put them in your own document or write them down somewhere. And as you do your research, answer them. Physically go in and answer the questions so that you see it in front of you and you see the information that's stemming from the sources that you're pulling. You're seeing the answers to these questions. And then by answering these questions, you can formulate a final thesis statement or a direction of exactly what you're going to say that is backed up and supported by the research you found in your background research. So, for instance, this is an example of a thesis statement that was formulated based on what this researcher found by answering her research questions. Cultural differences, varying cultural standards, and differing definitions of autism exist, further explaining why children in South Korea exhibit a far greater likelihood of being diagnosed with autism than children in the United States, primarily due to genetics, exposure to the cultural environment, and dietary habits. This is a very well-written thesis statement, and the main claim or the main point of the argument is found at the beginning. Cultural differences, varying cultural standards, and differing definitions of autism exist, further explaining why children in South Korea have a far likelihood of being diagnosed with autism than children in the United States. That's the main claim. Some of these ideas like cultural differences and cultural standards, these are things that she found in her research, but not necessarily the focus of her research. But it's important to integrate into the thesis statement if they're going to be discussed. And so that's the main claim. Your three subtopics or the contextual elements that's being researched are genetics, exposure to the cultural environment, and dietary habits. And so those are main point A, B, and C in the research paper, and the sources are going to back up those particular items. Now, you can use your sources throughout your research paper. A lot of people introduce the importance of an idea by quoting someone in their introduction. The idea is that every 2 to 3 sentences throughout your research paper should likely have some type of attribution or a source. This paper has little to do with you other than you organizing the sources to make a point, right? And so almost all of your research paper should be cited every 2 to 3 sentences. This is a great thesis, and I encourage everyone, after you answer your research questions, to formulate a thesis that looks very similar to this. It's going to be very detailed, but the main thing is that you have your main claim or what you're arguing, and then you have your 3 sections or your 3 elements that you're going to be observing and how. These 3 things can be effects, they can be causes, they can be different types of topics, subtopics in a phenomenon. It totally depends on what you're researching and where you're going with it. But you will need 3 main points. What do you do from here? Go ahead and conduct your background research, formulate your own research questions, and start collecting and evaluating your sources. We have 5 total that are required for the research paper. I want 3 of those to be peer-reviewed journals. I'll show you what that means in a moment. The majority of academic research at this level will rely exclusively on scholarly peer-reviewed journals. Peer-reviewed journals just mean that these are publications that are regularly published in certain disciplines that are reviewed by professionals in the field. They're a collection of research studies, articles, very specialized, usually intended for professionals in a certain field. There are academic journals in psychology, sociology, medical journals, veterinary journals. It depends on your field, but this is where you find that high-level critical and analytical research in your field. So we need 3 of those to be peer-reviewed journals, and the other 2 it can be any other source of your choosing, i.e. a website, video, but keep in mind that you have to evaluate ethos, pathos, and logos, and you have to make sure that your sources are all credible because that impacts your own ethos. So the second bullet point here, remember you need to think of ethos, pathos, and logos when you're choosing your sources. Pick sources that you think are credible and not too pathos or emotion driven. And always pick sources that are logos driven. So logical, they make sense. There's no fallacies or there's no faulty logic. They simply just make sense. There's no biases connected. And so just make sure you keep those things in mind when you're finding your research. I'm going to put together a folder on modules in Canvas that's got some worksheets to help you do this. Feel free to print them out. They help you evaluate the sources you choose. They help you with your keywords, so the search words that you use. I'm not going to require you to submit those, but I'm providing those because they're helpful resources as you go through this process. Just a note about scholarly sources. Academic papers are essentially reports that scholars write to their peers, present and future, about what they've done in their research, what they found, and why they think it's important. Depending on the discipline, they often have a structure that is reminiscent of lab reports you've written for science classes in the past. So anyone who's a doctor, anyone who is a doctor of a certain field, not a medical doctor or just a medical doctor, these research studies at that level are often in this format. You will find that there's an abstract at the beginning or a summary of what's to come in that paper. Oftentimes when you're conducting background research, you can look at the abstract and you'll know right then and there whether or not it's going to be sufficient for your purpose. There will be an introduction introducing all of the contextual details and the importance of the topic. Then you find a literature review, which is essentially a research paper like what you're putting together. Then you have data and methods, so how the study is how the study is conducted, what are the different parts of the studies, what are the variables, the controls. Then you have the results of the study, and then a conclusion that is going to extrapolate the findings to importance for